Da, 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 da. Hey, what's up?
Do you want me to leave that in the podcast cut?
That is up to you. You are 100% in charge of the audio.
It's staying in.
Great.
Yeah, great. Whatever. We're live. Hey, Wythe. I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm very excited to be here tonight on Why We Roll,
Same.
the tabletop RPG stream sometimes and podcast always. And yeah, I'm excited tonight because we're joined by Cody Pondsmith of our Talsorian games. I don't know if I'm even saying that correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You are saying it correctly. We don't make it easy, but you're saying it correctly.
How are you, Cody?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
Nice. Yeah, I've always wondered, actually, maybe you can enlighten us why it is called our Talsorian. I'm familiar with the games, but it occurs to me now that we have you, I don't know why it's called that. Maybe I should. Maybe it's very obvious.
So you would have very little way to know. The story is that it is our Talsorian because it is Ross Talsorian, because it is named after one of our investors from way back from when the company got started.
Whoa. Who names a company after an investor? That must have been like a wonderful human. You know what I mean?
That's
really
wild.
Mike had always heard, don't name your company after yourself. So he named it after an investor.
Got it. So you're saying it was going to be like Pondsmith Games, and then it's...
No, it was going to be Bonzo Fury Games.
Bonzo Fury.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I gotta say, that's a good name, but it has less weight than our Talsor. Like, there's something about that name that's just like fantasy. You know, it just like screams dragon to me for some reason.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like, it sounds like, well, I guess that's why I asked it the way that I did, because it sounds like a writer from a previous era when everyone used pseudonyms, but they were kind of boring pseudonyms, and a lot of the first letters were just, the acronym. So it like, W.H. Auden, H.P. Lovecraft, or, what's her name, Alice Sheldon being James Tiptree Jr. and like, why the Junior? They always have these questions around how people decide to sort of present themselves. So our Talsorian has that ring, but Bonzo anything is eye-catching as well. So anyway, so good to have you, Cody. You've designed a lot of RPGs and you have a new one coming out. Is that right?
I have, and I do.
Sick. So we'll talk about that. For those of you listening who haven't heard, we're going to be talking about Shadow Scar, which is a new game that is kind of about hopping around worlds, which I really like, and have made games that have some of those elements and played a lot of them. And it's also a bit about history, and specifically Japanese history, which I also really like. And the game has a whole sort of unified theme around essentially ninja, which is just fun. Yeah. So thank you, Cody, for making a ninja game. And, now we can just talk about ninja for as long as we want.
Hell yeah.
Before we do that, though, we do ask about kind of your background and how you got started. So, I don't know, maybe we should just open up there. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us kind of, what's your life in games? What brings you to being able to release a big new RPG?
Cool. So, hi, I'm Cody Pondsmith. I am, I guess, heir apparent to Mike Pondsmith, which is always important. People always ask me that. Conventions, they'll say, "Hey, I know that name."
They think it's random, like there were just two Pondsmiths who work at the same company.
Hey, wait a second.
Yeah. As you could probably imagine, I got into RPGs through my family. When I was growing up, when I was much younger, toddler, as it were, I was around for Talsorian as it was in kind of the previous era, as it were. But by the time I was, a fully sapient child, the company had kind of gone into a dormancy, as it were. While Mike was working at Microsoft and we were coming up to Washington. And I got into tabletop role-playing games actually through one of our games that I found among our stuff, Teenagers from Outer Space, which is a really system-light game about playing teenagers in an anime high school, both human and alien, coexisting and going on wacky adventures. and I was very interested in that because I was, quite a bit younger. I think like 10 or something. And I got Mike to run a game for me and my friends of Dangerous from Outer Space, and that's kind of how I got into it initially, was through that game. Me and all of my friends, role playing as alien teenagers, going on adventures and dealing with the rigors of being in high school. So that was kind of my first introduction to it, but because it was, it is a family business, I kind of got brought in slowly, deeper and deeper into the company as I kind of went on my own sort of weird little journey of game design. I wound up working in the mail room for a while before we had really gone out to distributors. I was sending out product to people. I had, invoices, and I just went through and got all of the books out of like a closet in our basement and packed them up, and then, gave them to Lisa to send out. And eventually I wound up helping a little bit on the ill-fated third edition of Cyberpunk. And eventually I wound up working on my own things. Actually, that's where Shadowscar comes in, because I was actually working on Shadowscar before I was working on Witcher.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So this is your like heartbreaker project, right? Like you've been working on it on and off for years.
Yeah,
this is
the
big one.
baby.
Awesome.
The initial concept for Shadowscar, I came up with a friend when we were 11. And the foundation of that was we were up late at a sleepover playing Naruto Ultimate Ninja 1, and thought, wouldn't it be amazing if there was a Naruto role-playing game?
We're getting so many deep cuts today.
Yes. And we set out with that as the goal. And of course, we were like 11, so we didn't get very far. But that concept kind of stuck. And I would continue to kind of build on that throughout basically my life, with the game kind of changing and molding as I grew up, changing from a Naruto role-playing game to what was effectively sort of almost like a Legend of Five Rings type game, to a period where it was a ninja high school game, and then eventually to something that kind of resembles what we have now. But yeah, over the last, at this point, I guess 19 years, this game has sort of evolved along with me. But it was not my first official entry into the space. That was Witcher.
Right.
Early on, when I was quite a bit younger, CD Projekt Red approached us about doing a Cyberpunk video game, and we said yes, obviously, and we kind of began development on that. But pretty shortly after that, they said, hey, we are looking for somebody to do a Witcher tabletop role-playing game, and would you be interested? And initially they came to us and were asking if Mike would be interested in it. Mike is not much of a fantasy guy these days. He is very particular about the fantasy he works with. So he came to me and said, hey, are you interested in this? Because at this point I was playing Witcher 2, and Lisa and I, my mother, were getting kind of big into the Witcher world. So I jumped on the chance. I said, absolutely. And effectively got an interview, as it were, with CD Projekt. We were going to be going over there as a sort of business trip to talk about Cyberpunk, like a couple months from then. So I said, okay, I'm gonna pitch this thing, and I'm gonna see if I can get them to let me work on Witcher. So being like 18, I think, I had very little concept of how to do a pitch, because I'd never done it before, and nobody told me anything. Granted, I never asked, but I thought about it. I said, what is the best way to prove to them that I can make a good role-playing game based on their property? And at the end of the day, I just came up with, I'll just make a role-playing game based on their property and show it to them. So I sat down over the next couple months and I basically painstakingly built what was the foundation of the Witcher tabletop role-playing game. I built out character creation so that I could show how characters were built and how the game would kind of function. And compile all of that into a horrible lime green binder and took that with me to Poland. And I sat down for the pitch, and once again, having no idea how pitches go, I just sat with them and walked like page by page through what I had written. And it took hours. But I went through the whole thing, and other people like from different parts of the company came and you know, stepped in and watched the pitch and all this stuff. Until I was pitching to some of the highest people in the company. And in the end, they were, you know, pleased with what I had done, and I got the job, as it were. The rest is history and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears.
I mean, that's yeah, I don't know, that's incredible. I'm kind of dumbfounded that that walking through page by page is what worked for you. That's amazing.
Yeah. That's cool in a way that your approach was to sort of do all of the design work up front. So they're
Yeah.
at least if they said yes, great, you've already done a lot of the work in a way. And if they said no, I mean, it's kind of like it. I mean, it, you know, it sounds like it would have been fun, probably disheartening, but also like fun to have just like built out a whole game and thought through it. And it must have shown a kind of attention to detail that you'd actually played the games, maybe read the novels, you know, whatever, that you'd engaged with the material to produce that kind of effort.
Yeah. Well, here's. Oh, go ahead.
No. I was just going to ask more about how you came up. You know, what did you do to sort of put it in that binder, right? But please, yeah. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, here's the kicker. They were working on Witcher 3 at that point. So I showed them all this stuff, and then they released Witcher 3, and I had to rewrite a bunch of it.
That's cool. So you got into the video games actually also by the RPG. Like you're kind of crashing into like their development timeline.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, I was going to ask, had you read the novels, or were you just, like, was the entry point for you just the video games at that point? Like, how deep in the lore were you getting with it?
The entry point for me was Witcher 2. I never played Witcher 1, and that was pre-Witcher 3. So I played Witcher 2 because they sent us a copy of their collector's edition as like a proof of concept. Like, you know, take a look at this. We can show you that we can make a good, you know, video game for Cyberpunk. So my introduction was through Witcher 2, and then as time went on, I would go on to read a bunch of the novels and kind of collaborate with Lisa, who was just tearing through the novels. She's an avid reader, and she was really into it, so she read through all the novels. And for the project, she sat down with a highlighter and went back and highlighted anything that could possibly be useful for building the RPG in the novels.
So that was like a combined, like you're playing through a video game and experiencing the world of The Witcher that way, and then you also have someone close to you kind of picking out some of the highlights. So that's an interesting way. I was just thinking of, you know, adaptation. We haven't adapted a lot of really anything I can think of, Chris, but we obviously look at source material in our games as well. So it's interesting to think about how do you go from some kind of source material to like a finished game that is playable, that's its own experience. And especially, with The Witcher, it must be hard to some degree because there's just so much stuff out there. There's more now, obviously, than when you got started in the RPG. And the RPG is part of it to me, but there's a lot of like Witcherness in the world and a lot of debate about it, etc. But obviously, it's a cool game, and the RPG version is really nice. So, yeah, do you maybe before we move to Shadowscar, can you tell us a little about your design process overall and kind of how do you approach like just being a TTRPG designer? Maybe things you've learned or how you over the course of that, I assume fairly big involved process, you know, like evolved your thinking. I don't know, Chris, if you have more to add to that. I'm just curious again about how do you go from like 0 to like 1,000, you know, with this big property.
Yeah, I think that's my question too, because it really is just jumping in to the deep end of the pool in a lot of ways. And that's such a different I think a different experience than what a lot of people, ourselves included, who we've interviewed on here have had, where it's like, well, it's like a hobby thing I did in high school, and then it kind of like there's a slow percolation over time. Yeah, so just leapfrogging onto what Wythe said, but yeah, like what was that experience like for you?
It was definitely, let's say, interesting. I had done a little bit of game design, amusingly, on Shadowscar at that point. But I was kind of building off of stuff that I had experienced through our games. So, I had played Cyberpunk, I had played Teenage from Outer Space, I'd played Castle Falkenstein. So I had this little foundation of game design that I kind of knew about. So I initially kind of took from that where I could, and just spent a lot of time tweaking. My design ethos is generally follows that a game needs to be unified in every aspect of it. So that means that on top of like art and lore and sort of presentation being unified, the system has to be unified too. So if you want a game to run a certain way, you have to make the system fit the way you want it to run. So for that in Witcher, that kind of manifested as after I had built out this sort of character creation system to show off. I started on the more of the foundation of how to play the game, and I spent a lot of time just cross-referencing to the video games. And there are a lot of aspects of the Witcher TRPG that you can see where they, were directly influenced by me looking at the video games and thinking, how am I going to make an RPG that presents the same experience as this video game? So this is why when they brought in, for instance, Witcher 3, this is why, for instance, in Witcher TRPG, we have fast strikes and strong strikes, because that is effectively modeling heavy attacks and light attacks in the video game. It's the reason that the alchemy system works the way it does. I really loved the alchemy system in Witcher 2. So I basically wholesale translated the alchemy system from Witcher 2 into the TRPG, complete with the different alchemical substances and the different items that contain those substances and everything like that. So a lot of my sort of building of design chops, I guess it were, is basically taking a foundation of stuff I knew and then trying to build on top of it with just admittedly kind of pure seat of my pants game design based on things that I had seen and wanted to bring into the game. I had a bit of a benefit in that for Witcher, one of the stipulations of me working on Witcher was that CDPR wanted the game to be based on Cyberpunk, because they grew up playing Cyberpunk and they wanted that system to kind of reflect the Cyberpunk system.
That's really interesting. I didn't actually know that bit of trivia about them.
So I had this extra foundation of like, okay, I'm going to take what we did in Cyberpunk 2020 and adjust it to be Witcher. And that adjustment took a lot. That adjustment took adding a magic system, adding 2 crafting systems, adding a critical injury system, which was based largely on the critical injury system from a game called Unhallowed Metropolis, which to this day is one of my favorites. It's a super weird, very niche RPG about Victorian zombie hunters, but it's super cool. So there was a lot of sort of, I like to say that I didn't really have like a scholarly introduction to role-playing games. It was more just me trying to figure out what worked for me and, twisting and turning that as I went until I found something that worked.
Yeah, well, so not that different from most people's experiences, just a jump in scale, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right, because I think a lot of us haven't read the sort of academic books, such as they are. There's not that many on RPGs. or game design more broadly, which there's a much bigger literature on, but again, it's still pretty small compared to even something like, I don't know, French Romanticism, or, I mean, you could name like a million other topics, right? And you'd find hundreds more books. So instead of that, I mean, most of us just try to make something for our friends that's fun. But in your case, you're diving into, right, the publishing end of things, the sort of making a product. And there are product specifications like length, or like you're saying, even like a system underlying it. And then also there's like a scale involved where like it's The Witcher. People know The Witcher, they're going to be expecting something. So it's cool that yeah, you were thinking about that kind of unity of design at the level of mechanics, lore, everything, so that playing the RPG would feel like playing the video game. But of course, you're in the driver's seat, which, at least I think for us on the call, like, we get why that's fun. Not to diss the video games. The video games are fun too, but it's a little different. So that's super cool. And then all the while, you have actually Shadowscar in your brain percolating.
Just in the background.
So yeah, maybe is this a good time to introduce, what is Shadowscar, and maybe, as you're introducing it, also reflecting on like how that changed over time. I know you said it sort of already had evolved genre-wise to this point, but
right.
Yeah. So what is Shadowscar?
So I like to think of Shadowscar as this overreaching game of intrigue and espionage across a multiverse of worlds, where you play agents of this secret society trained by ninjas and sent out into this multiverse with magic and technology and artifacts of magic to hunt down these disguised monsters hiding throughout the multiverse and working to bring all of these different worlds to ruin in service of what is effectively the afterlife itself of the home dimension of Shadowscar Nakatsukuni. This is its most recent iteration, like I said, and the game has evolved a fair amount. I could go all the way the hell back, but even in its modern iteration, it evolved a fair amount just in what the Shadowscar agency was like, how the world functioned. It's things like, the setting, the initial game was not multidimensional. I just did some multidimensional stuff in my own like home game. And that kind of branched over when I was talking to Mike at one point, like, hey, I want to do this for real. Do you have any suggestions? And he actually pointed out the multiversal stuff that I was talking about in my games and said, that's really key. Like, you should lean into that. And that's why, like, the four dimensions that you see in Shadowscar are all worlds that I ran in my own home games before they were sort of brought into the larger game itself.
Yeah, got it. I also appreciate that it's limited to 4 dimensions, and it's not just kind of like an infinite multiversal thing, which can get out of hand very quickly.
Well, it was always generally going to be fairly small because I've read other multiversal games, and I personally believe that the key problem is that you just get players who are massively overwhelmed because you bring in so many things. And the problem is that in addition to bringing in so many things, you can only bring in so much content. We had a discussion about Shadowscar earlier on of like, okay, we could bring in, 8 different worlds, but if we want to have detail about them, then we're going to be writing like a 600-page book. Or, we could bring in 8 different worlds and give them all like 2 pages, and we would be presenting a massive breadth of worlds with no depth. So the initial idea was basically to put together 4 worlds that get a lot of detail, and what they work like, what the exciting parts of them are, and then we can add worlds as we go if we want to do that. But we keep a very understandable foundation for everybody to start with.
Right. Yeah, and I really like that, and it reminds me of the most successful aspects of multidimensional games anyway, and one could argue, so Stillfleet, the game I made is you're going to different planets, but in a way they're reduced to like types. It's like most planets are going to be sort of similar for a reason. And then your home world is weird, and then Earth is kind of special, and then there's like another sort of dimension. So there's sort of like 4 spaces, even though there's plenty of just generic like terraformed worlds or whatever. But I think that gives you a lens. Like, you're starting in a very specific alien space station. You have a certain lens on things, and here you're starting with a Shadowscar agency in a kind of version of medieval Japan that's been anime style destroyed, and you have a kind of a lens onto these other worlds that are very, very different. So you have a kind of Victorian steampunk Castle Falkenstein-ish world. You have this like night between the wars, right? Sort of between World War One and World War II noir type world that's really interesting, where it's sort of like you're in a movie. And then you have refuge, right? So you have this very like hard sci-fi. Earth has been destroyed by the yokai, by the demons, and people are living in the space station world, and they all feel very different, but they give you a sense of what it means to be a Shadowscar agent, because you're the one going out and connecting the things. So your job of doing sort of espionage and helping these worlds kind of fight off, like discover basically and fight off essentially demons, which feels very epic, very anime, but it's particularized to these specific locations. And you imply that there's other worlds, and to your point, you could always add on more books, but in a way you don't need to have those to have adventures, because just with those things I named, it's already like, oh my god, my head's swimming. And you can imagine cool connections, and I think you model that in the adventure that comes to the quick start, where you're hopping between the worlds is another kind of space or like way to do the game. So I don't know if I'm jumping ahead too much there, but I just thought it was a neat way to kind of both have a game feel very expansive, but to your point, you're able to focus when you want on these things. So maybe it sounds like that decision to even have it multidimensional, right? And which worlds to choose. Those are things that evolved over time. But maybe can you tell us a little about moving from, you have all these ideas in your head or notebooks or whatever, to like making Shadowscar, and how that process has come about, and maybe like where we're at, presently.
So, okay. That process has been largely iterative. It was kind of taking what I had built previously and then kind of adding those concepts in. And as far as sort of Shadowscar, it was a process of kind of piecemeal adding things in to bring in those worlds. So it was things like adding in a system of homelands. Where do you come from? What does that do for you? There was a time when it was a much more like almost playbook based game, where you picked not only a world, but there were different playbooks for all the different worlds, and you picked one of those, and that gave you, all this stuff. And that was like the foundation of your character, which we eventually moved away from because it kind of pigeonholed players into, a few different types of characters. There was building out the worlds themselves and kind of figuring out how they interacted with each other and what you could get from them, which involved a fair amount of work on figuring out like tech levels for these different worlds. Like, how much technology do they have? What do they share? What, for instance, is different between 5th Street and Nakatsukuni, based on the fact that Nakatsukuni has the tech level of roughly 17th century Japan, but it has magic. So that magic fills in a lot of the things that would be done by technology, say, for instance, in 5th Street. Once again, it was that iterative process of trying to basically fit things in here and there, plug things on, and make them then merge with the larger form, as it were.
Can you give us some examples of never mind, that's not how I wanted to ask that question. How I wanted to ask that question is, are there ways in which you've mechanicalized the connections between spaces or worlds, other than, sharing items and things like that as well?
We generally have tried not to make big mechanical differences. There were some ideas early on, like, what if magic worked differently in different dimensions? Or, how do you take one item from one world to another? And a lot of that got dropped as it kind of added this weird extra layer that complicated everything.
Yeah, I would imagine.
You know, it made this issue of like, what if I take a sword from Refuge and I take it to 5th Street, is that okay? If I have a handgun from Refuge and I try to go to Nakatsukuni, do I have to swap guns because they're different types of guns? There's the question of like, how should magic work differently in a world that has magic compared to a world that doesn't? But that caused a whole lot more complexity than I really wanted. So a lot of that was kind of dropped in favor of the game running more smoothly and being more approachable in a lot of ways, being something that you don't have to take a whole lot of time to try and parse.
Sure.
The big mechanical thing between the worlds is rift diving, which I put a lot of thought into and has always been an interesting aspect of the setting. Rift diving being the unsafe way to go between dimensions. So you can always go between dimensions using gates. The agency has all these gates set up in all these different locations that you step through the gate and you step into another dimension. But that is the safe way to go between dimensions, and not everybody has access to that. The yokai, for instance, the enemies, and rogue agents have to do what's called rift diving, where you tear a hole between realities and then attempt to almost hurl yourself out of your reality into another one.
That sounds sick.
This process is extremely dangerous, but it allows you to jump between dimensions and effectively get from one world to another without having to have a gate. The problem is that in doing that, you are placing yourself in what's called the in-between, which is the place between dimensions. And the in-between is actively hostile to mortal forms. You cannot be in the in-between for particularly long because your body is not used to being outside of a dimension. So if you take too long, you will gravitate into a world. The problem is that world may not be the world you were aiming for. So if you take too long in the in-between, you might fall into a dimension you were not even vaguely attempting to get to and have to rift dive your way out or be stuck there depending. But the big problem is that the in-between is the only place where you can see the entirety of what's called the mosaic, which is this organization of worlds. And we play a lot with the fact that the mosaic is in a lot of ways ineffable, and there are a lot of aspects of the mosaic that are even beyond the understanding of the agency that drive the mind to madness to even try to comprehend. So in rift diving, you have to focus very specifically on the world you're trying to get to, or you will glimpse the entirety of the mosaic, and you are at very high risk of being thrown into a coma, taking permanent brain damage, or we don't talk about this in the starter box, but we talk about it in the core book, trying to make sense of what you're seeing, which is a very dangerous process, but can start to actually allow you to see what is unseen in the mosaic around you.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, I love that it's in the quick start. It's like just listed as like, this is so dangerous. It's just not here.
Yeah, we can't even talk about it.
You just go crazy. But maybe there'll be rules later.
It's great. Well, yeah. So we've got ninjas, we've got multiversal hopping, we've got cosmic horror elements, and like you said, Cody, before we jumped on, we were asking Cody about horror, and you said that it's not your thing, but you keep coming back to it. Here we are again. Can you give us an example of some of the mechanics and how you've tied them into these big themes and some of the story beats that you're trying to drive at?
So a lot of the system is designed to facilitate the interactions we want. The biggest showpiece of that is the assassination mechanic. The the foundation of Shadowscar is supposed to be a stealth game. You are playing secret agents and ninjas. So the theory is that you should be able to get into the locations where you're having your missions, do whatever your objective is, and get out without causing chaos, without blowing anything up, without letting a million civilians see what you're doing. So we really try to emphasize and effectively prioritize stealth in the game. The big section of that is the assassination mechanic, which is taken from games like Tenchu Z and Assassin's Creed and other stealth-based video games, where if you get the drop on an opponent, you can sneak up on them. You can make a stealth check to attempt to just kill them outright. The stealth check is against the awareness skill base of the opponent, so it can be pretty high. And if you fail, you have effectively done no damage, alerted the person you were trying to assassinate to your presence, and also anyone in the area to the fact that you just tried to kill someone.
That's hilarious.
But if you succeed, then you kill that person outright. Doesn't matter how many hit points they have, doesn't matter what state they're in. You kill them outright, and you are unnoticed by the people around you. So it functions to basically say, I am going in to do this thing, but there's a guard. There's a patrolling monster. I could go down and fight that monster or fight that guard, and it would take a long time, and it would be really loud. So we've presented a way for you to say, okay, if I can get the drop on the guard, then I can take that guard out, and I won't have to have this big fight, and I won't have to cause all this racket, and I can continue being stealthy. You can continue to carry that stealth, and it has a little bit less of the sort of punishing nature of stealth gameplay. In a lot of games, because there isn't an option for stealthily taking somebody out or something like that, you have that problem of like one mess up and stealth is out the window, which is a major problem. In a stealth game, we don't want it to be like, I got a bad roll one time and now everything is for nothing.
Yeah.
When you have both mechanics, you
ahead.
have like a sneak mechanic with people having an awareness check against you, which is similar to like in our games, we're sneaking by rolling movement and someone's rolling will to perceive you. But you also have the assassination mechanic, which I had written down. So I have this like list of my notes are like ninja, yokai, Japanese folklore, assassinate as an action, like so we're hitting all the things. But yeah, and I feel like giving players those tools and making them simple enough and elegant enough and appealing enough, to your point, so they understand the gambling kind of mechanic behind it right away, without having to roll endless dice or something, is really fun. And giving them different ways to play out what it means to be a ninja. You have the different sort of clans of ninja that have different styles, it seems like, which I'd love to know more about as well. But we do have one question in the chat, which is just, can you stack advantages on that? So I don't know if you can go into even more in the mechanics of like, if we were to do an assassinate action, how that would play out. But I guess we should step back and say, so it is a D6 based game, right? You have a D6 pool based on essentially your statistics, and then you have a skill. And then there's some actions that have some other mechanics. Is that fair to say, Cody?
Yeah. So basically all resolution is done with a D6 dice pool. You're aiming to roll 4 and above. It's a 50-50 split, and then 6s count as 2 successes. The assassination mechanic is pretty straightforward for lower level threats. You basically need to get up on them and roll a stealth check against their awareness skill base. So if they would normally roll 4 dice, you have to beat a 4 or get a 4 successes. And that is a success right there. You can get bonuses to that. For instance, if you're wearing a shozoku, which is the traditional ninja outfit, then you can get bonuses to sneaking up on people in the dark and things like that. And there's even ways that your friends can help you, like by distracting enemies and things like that, giving you bonuses, i.e. extra dice to roll for that check. But things get trickier when you are trying to assassinate either a player character for some reason or a higher level threat. These are creatures that will not go down with one hit as easily as lower level, mooks, as it were. And you have to initiate the assassination with that stealth check. But then, much as you would see with some of the tougher enemies in a video game with a takedown mechanic, you have to follow that up with a usually a melee skill check against their athletics or whatever they're going to defend with.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the classic like sneak up and grab them from behind, hand over the mouth, and then you have the like go into stab them, and maybe they grab your arm or whatever, and you got to get them.
A bit of a tussle.
Yeah,
I
little
really,
bullet time.
Yeah, a little bullet time. I really love it. I mean, I was going to say also a kind of a bullet time thing. It's reminding me of my favorite parts of Ghost of Tsushima, if you've played that game, Cody, where you're a samurai who then kind of becomes a ninja, and you have to make this moral choice. You can either duel people, or you can just sneak up and stab them in the back. And it turns out that stabbing them in the back is way more effective and way faster, and it's also pretty fun. But you still have the option, which I think is really interesting.
Of like sleeper I haven't played this, so it's
Yeah.
like you can either just knock them out or kill them, basically.
No, you can. I mean, you can
Or
either
you kill them
assassinate them, or you can like fight them head on.
Got it.
And it's kind of like the moral code that you're choosing in the game influences other
almost
decisions.
like a mechanic for like, are you a good or bad person emergent from the actions, which I know games have tried to do a little bit. It makes me think also hilariously just of that guy Joel Haver did a video that was like, Metal Gear Solid from the NPC's perspective or whatever, but it's like these mooks standing there and they're always like, yeah, so anyway, I'll probably go to the game with my son next week. What was that? And then there's like obviously a guy just like frozen, behind a trash can, and they're like, I thought I heard something. Wasn't anything, and it just happens over and over again. It's like this, they keep making the sneak check by one to like not alert, and they're obviously like right there with a gun. But okay, so we should move on from assassinate, but that's an example of kind of the way that the game mechanicalizes being a ninja without making it extremely heavy or have lots and lots of, as you say, like other rules, right? It's pretty much a D6 pool system that's tied to the same skills throughout. And then there's different kind of equipment and sort of a magic system, Mikio, which is some powers you get. And it seems like the pregens, there's 6 pregens that come with a quick start, all have different powers. And then there's many, many monsters that come with a quick start. And I shouldn't say monsters, encounters of various kinds, people and kind of yokai. So Japanese sort of demons of various types. And they all have different powers as well. So I'm wondering if you want to say any more about sort of the lore or like what is going on, because there is this whole lore book that comes with it that's very rich and drawing on Japanese folklore. So turning to like behind the ninja, behind the fun, mechanicalization, simulation of fighting, why ninja and why Japanese folklore, and how did you sort of decide the right level to weave into the game, and just what is the sort of pitch for like being a kind of hero ninja in this? That's how I read it anyway. It's like you're a good ninja. But yeah,
I've always been interested in Japanese history and Japanese mythos. I find it really fascinating and really unique in a lot of ways. And so, the foundation of that carrying into Shadowscar was kind of a given in a lot of ways after I kind of divorced it from a much more sort of, abstract concept. And the actual like plot line, the Uber plot line, I guess, of Shadowscar, is inextricably linked to sort of the mythos of Japan that you find in like the Kojiki and other historical sources. So that is kind of the way it functions, is that in history lesson, I guess, the foundation of Shadowscar, the Shadow War, the Veil War that you were fighting, is actually the effect of the end of another war that turned out terribly for everybody in a way. We go all the way back to effectively the foundation of Nakatsukuni, because Nakatsukuni is inherently an unfinished dimension. It had been starting to be created, but it was cut off in the middle as basically the mother and father deities, functionally, Izanagi and Izanami, were setting about creating Nakatsukuni, creating the islands, creating the seas, creating all of the spirits of nature and the gods, until, much like in the Kojiki and the Japanese creation myth, Izanami, the mother goddess, dies in childbirth, giving birth to the spirit of fire. Her spirit goes down to Yomi no Kuni, which is the afterlife in Japanese mythology. And stricken by grief, Izanagi, her husband, goes down into the afterlife to bring her back, to save her from death, effectively. The problem is that this does not go as planned. He gets down there and he finds Izanami's soul, but she has already accepted the hospitality of the ruler of the underworld, and thus been tied to the afterlife itself. There's extra mystery to some extent in Shadowscar because the afterlife as it exists has been changed in some way. It moved from a fairly peaceful land of the dead into this sort of horrible crypt where lost souls wander. And the actual master of the afterlife, Yomi, who is the ruler of Yomi no Kuni, is little more than a desiccated husk on a throne of obsidian, who is quite clearly possessed, perhaps even by something else, some form of dark, foul magic or anger. But his anger, is this force, effectively makes a deal with Izanagi and says, you can take Izanami's soul back, but only if you wait outside her chambers for her to finish preparing for her journey back to the land of the living. And you must wait there, and you must not check, you must not go in, you must not open the door. And Izanagi sits by the door and waits, but time passes. Minutes turn to hours, turn to days, turn to months, and Izanami is nowhere to be seen. So eventually, deeply worried for his wife, Izanagi throws open the door to see if she is still, all right, to check in on her. And in that moment, he sees Izanami splayed out in her bed chambers, twisted and rotting, with the spirits of terrible creatures sort of almost molding out of her body. And at this point, kind of in line with this deal that he has made with Yomi, Izanami is forfeit, effectively. Her spirit has been taken over by Yomi entirely, and she actually, in a fit of almost magically possessed rage, attacks Izanagi and goes after him, summoning the hordes of the afterlife and these 8 spirits of destructive thunder that had basically been created from her body. Izanagi manages to escape, getting to the gateway of the afterlife and rolling this massive boulder in front of it to stop the hordes of the afterlife from getting out. But Izanami, now completely possessed by the power of Yomi no Kuni, promises that she will one day return and basically bring destruction to the entirety of the world of the living. Izanagi goes on to effectively live in relative isolation, ruined effectively by the loss of his wife, until centuries and centuries later, when the prophecy, as it were, comes to pass. Izanami and her undead horde almost break free from the afterlife, break free from Yomi no Kuni, and go on a wage war against the land of the living. Using her power, Izanami twists the minds of all of the magical creatures, the yokai of Japanese myth, and makes them into an army of dangerous monsters, and starts what's called the 100 Years of Sorrow, which is this massive apocalyptic war in which humanity and the spirits of nature and the gods fight to stay alive and keep their world effectively from being destroyed. This war goes on for a century, decades of war that is slowly tearing the world itself apart, with the gods clashing over battlefields of soldiers fighting monsters, waging war back and forth, tearing up the land in an attempt to stop this onslaught from the underworld. This is kind of where the ninja come into it, because while there are soldiers and samurai out fighting on the front lines, it is determined eventually that a stealthier hand is needed. So after effectively they are freed from Yomi by Susanoo, the god of the storms, the Daitengu, who are these extremely powerful sage-like magical creatures, offer to give their knowledge to humanity and build the great clans, which are these clans of warfare and knowledge and magic, bringing all the knowledge of the Daitengu to humanity. And of them, there are 5 great clans of shadow, which are shinobi clans built from the remnants of all of these other clans that have been partially destroyed by the war, who are brought together to act as effectively the sort of special ops of the side of life itself, to go in and assassinate powerful yokai and get intel on their movements and things like that, to help kind of turn the tide of this apocalyptic war. In the end, through all of this fighting, they eventually reach 100 years of conflict, and there seems to be no end in sight. So, as a complete last-ditch attempt to end the war, Izanagi and the gods set together this plan that they will attempt to mortally wound Izanami and then banish her out of reality, in hopes that that will cut her off from Yomi and effectively get rid of her and her power, which is affecting the yokai, and stop the war. This goes into the last siege of Kyoto, which is this massive battle, last stakes for humanity and the gods, in which, with the aid of a group of shinobi keeping Izanami busy, Izanagi is able to strike a mortal blow to his now corrupted wife and cut a shadow scar across the sky, this massive black tear that he then banishes Izanami and all of her yokai horde into. And this seems to end the war. This brings this apocalyptic conflict to an end. But there's a complication, which is that the gods unknowingly have tossed Izanami and all of these monsters into the in-between. They have no idea that there are other worlds beyond their own, but in creating this portal, they've effectively thrown all these creatures into the in-between, and all of them begin to fall into other dimensions around Nakatsukuni, causing chaos, starting to effectively tear these worlds apart in their own nefarious ways. When this is eventually discovered by Susanoo, who goes out into the mosaic to try to find Izanami in hopes that she can be saved, the gods realize that in getting rid of Izanami, they have doomed a bunch of other worlds. And more importantly, they can't find Izanami in all of this chaos. So there is this fear that grips the people of Nakatsukuni that this is not over. At some point, Izanami will return, and she will bring this apocalyptic war back to Nakatsukuni. And there's no way of knowing, now that they have used their final resort, how they will survive that. And so the Shadow Scar Agency is created to find Izanami and stop her from returning, but also to stop all of these yokai from destroying the worlds that they have been dropped into. And this is kind of the start of what is called the Veil War, which you are playing in the game.
Yeah, I love that, because it gives you this through line where, you know, you can go on picaresque adventures between different dimensions and fight yokai, but you can also, like, you know, if the party moves that way, or if you want it to move that way, you can be a part of this bigger overarching conflict. It's nice to have that option right from the hook, really.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how you've taken Kojiki and kind of a eternal tale that is present in many cultures, as Vex is pointing out in the chat. You know, the legend of Orpheus, and you look at Osiris, right, and the idea of sort of the partner. There's sort of often like a bad brother or some sort of figure like that, whether the wife dies or the husband dies in Osiris' case, and you have these mysteries of return and relations to, you know, ideas about death and rebirth at the level of the individual, society. Spring and winter in the earth. And then on top of it, you have this anime level Götterdämmerung, right? So that happens, and then it leads to, you know, oh shit, now we're fighting, you know, the Twilight of the Gods, you know, time and space are being rent apart. And that feels very anime, which I know is a big influence on the game, right? And it's meant to feel sort of like an anime game, but as you say, it's a game about espionage. So actually, we're not playing in the Götterdämmerung era when you'd have anime like cyber paladin samurai with like 18-foot swords or whatever was happening. That was all the deep past. Now for a long time we've been in this kind of Cold War, which I know Chris knows I like really love, you know, espionage kind of settings where yeah, there's a conflict and it's really, really important, but normal day-to-day life is like normal day-to-day life. So you can't go around anime murking people. You know, you have to kind of move in stealth and have a kind of different relationship to society as as PICAROs, as heroes, as whatever, specialists with swords. So I think that's cool. I think you've done a lot of like thought, obviously, to take real Japanese folklore and some of those anime influences and put them together quickly enough. Because even the account you just gave, I will say, is I think longer than the one, at least in the quick start. Like in a quick start, it's a couple pages and you're like, wow, okay, big intro, big scrolling yellow text. And then you're kind of in the world of, okay, it's the present. You're a ninja in the Shadowscar Agency. You get to sort of choose how you're going to go about, you know, finding hidden yokai. And I like that last idea that the yokai generally is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Cody, if I'm misreading this, but it seems to be they generally wear, I think kamen is the term, right? They wear masks and they sort of appear human generally now in these four kind of settled worlds. And your job is often to figure out kind of what they're up to. So it's probably something that they're deep space, you know, in another dimension, Izanami and the really bad, you know, yokai are out there. But you're generally sort of pulling at those threads in a more sort of espionage or maybe cosmic horror driven mode. So yeah, I think as Chris is saying, it definitely feels like it offers up a lot of directions to go as a GM and as a player. Maybe one way to turn that into question is just to ask, like, you know, how has this gone in playtesting? I'm guessing you've playtested a lot. I'm guessing you've done some campaigns. Do you have any good stories or things that have influenced your writing in terms of like, okay, wow, I need, you know, that campaign went really off the rails or those kind of learnings. You know what I mean?
It's generally so I run Shadowscar very much as like a spy thriller in a lot of ways. I've always enjoyed that sort of approach to it because I think it really shows what Shadowscar is the best. And that has done me pretty well in a lot of games. I've run a lot of Shadowscar. And I've run a fair amount of sort of new era Shadowscar, as it were, in like playtesting for the starter box and the easy mode and the like. And one of the things that always kind of comes across the most is that interaction across dimensions. That with different players coming from different worlds, I find that people always have good opportunities to role play as they are, you know, playing these characters from very different worlds, interacting with each other now as teammates and having to go to other worlds and interact with those people. So you might be in a game where, you know, you have two people from Nakatsukuni, but then you go to 5th Street and now these two people who are used to 17th century Japan are dropped into the 1920s in America. And there might be one person from 5th Street in that group who's now having to kind of guide everybody else through being in their world, as it were. And I always love it when you get interactions in that way of different players playing to the world that they were part of. And you get things like, you know, my favorite joke about Shadowscar is that you have an agent from 5th Street and an agent from Refuge, and the agent from 5th Street is trying to describe the Great War, and they're talking about, the horror of the trenches and, living day to day under possible artillery fire. And the agent from Refuge says, "Oh, okay, you're talking about World War One." And the really fifth grade agent says, "Wait, one?"
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that multiverse thing is really wild when you put it that way. That the characters are kind of from similar Earths, but that have gone in these very different directions.
They're just different enough to have like different histories. Okay, I have a two-part question. Do the other worlds or planes or however you want to put it know about Nikatsukune? Do they know about the mosaic? And then how does one become a ninja for the Shadow Scar Agency? Because you can have somebody from Fifth Street or from Refuge. Like, what's the through line there?
So none of the other worlds know about Nikatsukune, and Nikatsukune only barely knows about the other worlds. The agency keeps a lot of stuff close to the chest as far as what's going on in the other dimensions. And in fact, they keep it so close to the chest that the official line from the agency is that Izanami is definitely gone and the yokai are definitely not coming back. But the agency is just helping out these other dimensions clean up the yokai so that they can't cause any problems. So they downplay what the Veil War is tremendously to keep panic from spreading into Katsukuni.
Sure, yeah, makes sense.
Right.
So agency members come from kind of two different groups, because there's the people from Nikatsukuni who, for them, the Shadow Scar Agency is like, the FBI would be for us. It is a known governmental body, and it has this sort of mysterious, like, kind of alluring, like, oh, they're secret agents who go between worlds and they see all of these different dimensions and whatnot. So some people from Nikatsukuni just like apply to join the agency. People from other worlds, the infected worlds, don't get that option though. There are some cases in which people, very specific people from different dimensions, will be approached by the Shadow Scar Agency because they have a particular set of skills that the agency wants to utilize. But in a lot of cases, people who join the agency are joining the agency because they got involved in something they shouldn't be involved in. There are a vast number of agents in the Shadow Scar Agency who, for instance, stumbled on a yokai and saw it was not human and happened to get picked up by the agency as part of the agency's mission in that area. There are members who found a weird thing and got totally set on a conspiracy that they tracked down and found out was actually a genuine conspiracy that the agency was part of.
Mm-hmm.
And there are even agents who were directly saved by the agency in the most literal sense. The agency has ways to capture spirits and resettle them to resurrect people effectively. So there are agents who died in some horrible mishap, whether it was a yokai rampage or some aspect of a mission gone wrong, and they are then effectively given the option to be resurrected and join the agency to help fight the forces that led to their death in the first place.
That's like a whole other direction you can go with the story too. Like I don't know if you've read the book Mikey 7. They're making it into a movie soon called Mikey 17, but it's about this guy who is sci-fi. He is a low level worker on a beachhead colony in far space, and basically he dies a lot, and then they just make new clones of him and then upload his memories into those clones. So by the time the book starts, you're on the 7th iteration of this person, and he has to keep working for this company through all of his deaths. So anyway,
it's very dystopian.
Run a campaign with that in it if you felt like it.
One of the super neat, terrible things about Shadow Scar that I like to highlight sometimes is that when a character dies, their spirit is unsettled from their body and becomes a wandering spirit in the spirit world. And the traditional way to deal with that is to take that spirit and place it in a spirit lantern so it can be contained, because a spirit left in the spirit world will eventually pass on. The problem is that passing on, as far as the agency understands it, is passing on to the afterlife, and carries a chance of your spirit being grabbed by Yomi and turned into some form of terrible monster.
That's hilarious.
And the side effect of that is that because a spirit lantern can keep spirits indefinitely, there are agents who have died and have effectively chosen not to be resurrected by the agency, but also not to let their spirits pass on and possibly get turned into a horrible monster, who exist in spirit lanterns in hopes that at some point the war will be over and they can actually pass on to a positive afterlife.
That's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah, this it's got shades of like Evangelion and Berserk, and this kind of play with sort of religion across traditional East Asian religions and myths from even Kojiki's predate Buddhism, I think, but and then kind of Western ideas that have been brought in, ideas of heaven and hell, and like kind of especially like in the Victorian setting, you have the idea that people are contacting spirits. Whereas a lot of the rest of the game, you're sort of looking at kami, and there's this idea from sort of Shinto, this syncretic Buddhism and Shinto tradition in Japan, that there's kind of always spirits of some kind around, and there's bigger and smaller ones, and you don't have a ton of agency over them, but they might know what you're up to. And I think it's interesting to have this sort of anime level, like you don't want to die because you might get turned into like an evil demon ghost, or so you might just choose to be like a friendly ghost lantern for your buddies for an indefinite period of centuries, which is both sort of dystopian, but also sort of noble, but also like not important to the game necessarily. It's just like yet another idea of that background lore that comes with, I think, in part working on a game for a really long time, where you have all the lore in your head and you can choose when to deploy it as a writer, have little gems show up throughout, a quick start, throughout a rule book. So I do think the game will appeal to folks in that level, because it's clearly bringing a lot of those the best bits, right, of your brain to the forefront. You've had like a decade to sort of select them. So that's not a question, but I did have something in mind. I'll come back to it. It slipped my attention now, but I know what I want to say. So something we did want to get to at some point is just how do you sort of deal with sort of the political in games, because that's something that we're both really interested in and have a lot of thoughts on. But this game specifically, it has a really political vibe, but obviously the politics is this anime politics, right? Where there's absolute sort of evil out there, and you need to sort of find it and get rid of it. But at the same time, there is day-to-day politics. As you're saying, was just the Great War in one planet, and then you go to another planet and they've had just like sort of almost an environmental disaster. I mean, yeah, it was caused by a tsunami of demons or whatever, right? But it's sort of like no one's fault, as far as I understand, on Refuge, of the survivors. And so you have different kinds of settings with different real world sort of adjacent problems. And I'm curious if you just have any thoughts on that, or ways in which you've seen the game function in a way to get to some of those real sort of concerns via this very epic, very myth driven kind of ninja lore. And feel free to be like, it doesn't do that. I mean, you tell me, it's your game.
Well, I've always been of a mind that I don't want to whitewash history. There are very unpleasant things that have happened in history, and those things happen in Shadowscar too. For instance, we don't talk a lot about it, but we talk in Fifth Street about sort of the legacy of the Civil War, and how the world, at least the US, is still segregated, and there are all of these hate groups effectively, and that a lot of them are very powerful. In the 1920s, we're dealing with the Ku Klux Klan actually being an extremely powerful entity, as it were. We talk a lot about the sort of caste system almost of Victorian England, where people are born into different social strata. And my favorite, it doesn't show up in the starter set, but there are factions in the core book that are per dimension. And I did a lot of research into the time periods for a lot of these different worlds. And my favorite is there's a faction called the Diamond Society in Steel Court. And it is like effectively sort of a gentleman's club where you have to be a high aristocracy and you join, and based on your lineage and your sort of social station, you get a diamond rating. So it creates this caste system within the aristocracy to be able to say, well, I'm a 17 carat in the Diamond Society. But the foundation of this faction is that the founder of the faction, who is high aristocracy, was absolutely shattered one day when a middle class family bought the same China tea set that he did. And so he set out because one big aspect of that time period is that the middle class was just starting to develop and just starting to kind of vaguely threaten the aristocracy, with, having almost not the same level of like money and affluence, but starting to be able to like buy the same tea sets and things like that. So this character founds the Diamond Society, and like the last sentence in that is the the poor may rise up, but they'll never be part of the Diamond Society.
Ouch.
Yeah, they'll never get verified on X.
Yeah, they'll never get the blue check mark.
And in Refuge, we talk about the fact that like humanity has been nearly driven to extinction, and the tricky part is that the people in Refuge, the ones who are still around, are on either the Selene lunar colony or the Eos space station. And both of these were effectively created because in Refuge's world, the Cold War goes hot. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, there is an airstrike that is brought down on Cuba as a preemptive strike before a raid of Cuba. And unfortunately, that airstrike hits where the Soviets were keeping a bunch of their bombs. And so there's what's called the Cuban detonation, which is a stockpile of nuclear weapons stockpiled in Cuba, all blowing at the same time, which destroys like most of Cuba, or at least most of Western Cuba, and leads to the United Nations basically putting together this plan of like, we're going to create this lunar colony and we're going to put representations of all humanity on the moon. And the official is like, we're spreading out into space, and the unofficial is, if we nuke the entire planet, there's going to be something left.
Right, which happens in like the Shishin Lu books, the Three Body Problem too. There's like the UN has its main strategy for dealing with aliens, but then there's a couple other strategies that are just like B and C plots. And as a reader, because it's such a picaresque trilogy, at points you're like, why am I reading this? And then later the characters will come back and you'll be like, wow, I'm really glad they did that thing. They couldn't have known, but like they just were like hedging a lot of bets, and there's different ideas, different governments. So I love the intricacy there. I wanted to get at I know we're gonna run out of time, so I wanted to give you plenty of time to talk about like all the things people get, but I don't want to cut you off, Cody, so please finish what you're saying. That's everything you're saying is really rad. I'm really into it. But I'm also curious if you can just bring us to like the state of Shadowscar and what you want people to do and what the book or series of books is going to be. But please, I'm sorry, I apologize for interrupting there.
No, you're good. You're good. So the state of Shadowscar at the moment is we put out the easy mode, our Eyes in the Darkness handout, which is sort of our taster of Shadowscar. Anybody can find that on DriveThruRPG, and if you find us at conventions, we usually have a bunch of them at the show just to hand out. if you are curious about Shadowscar but aren't willing to invest money in it quite yet, that's a really good way to determine if you're going to like it. It has everything you need to play several sessions of the game and shows you all of the different worlds in sort of order, so you can kind of get the entire feel for the setting. The starter box just came out at Gen Con this year, and that is sort of our next on-ramp. It has everything you need to play for like a good 10 sessions or so, including pre-generated characters with advancement rules, and a big adventure book full of exciting adventures spreading across the mosaic. Everything from raiding ancient Olmec temples under the sea in 5th Street to trying to assassinate a hidden yokai at a Dambe boxing match in Refuge. It is a really good way to get into it if you feel like you're going to want to play for a little bit. I think it actually works as a pretty good standalone, but the cool part is that it is actually a continuation of the plot line of the starter handout. So effectively, you play through Eyes in the Darkness, and Eyes in the Darkness kind of ends on a bit of a cliffhanger that then is picked up by the starter set. So the third part of this triad, as it were, which is the core book, is still in process. We were hoping for a December release, but we may wind up having to push it back a little bit. But that contains, everything you need to play. It's got a absolutely massive bestiary of like 40 different threats. It's got an adventure at the back. It's got a tremendous world lore section that tells you all about all the different dimensions and the different ninja clans and what the agency is actually like and stuff like that. Plus, obviously, character creation and character advancement and all that fun stuff. So really, at the moment, if you're interested, give the easy mode a try. If you're even more interested, check out the starter set, and then keep your ears posted, your ears open for for the starter, for the core book coming soon.
Very nice.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't wait. We gotta like all go to Cuba and play like Stillfleet and Shadowscar and Hunting Billionaires for Sport by Vex and these other games. Oh, that's what I want. I'm sorry. That's the reason I started talking. The last question I completely forgot. No guns. So there are guns, but it feels like in reading the quick start, guns are not a big part of the experience of being a ninja. Is that on purpose? It seems like most people are using like whips and ninjutsu, which makes sense. They're ninja. But it feels like you've imagined some different scenarios where you wouldn't really need or have guns, or it wouldn't help necessarily because you're trying to keep things veiled and not freak people out. Which again, I just thought was a nice way to design a game. So it's not that violence doesn't exist, but it's the way you're placing the player in a certain role helps militate against a kind of just like, Warhammer 40K shooting bad alien sort of dynamic. So sorry, Cody, that's what I wanted to ask about 2 questions ago.
So guns can be very useful. They can do a lot of damage at a lot of range. Shotguns and machine guns can dish out damage to a lot of people with a single shot, but they are all loud, which means firing them off is going to alert people around you, if nothing else, to the fact that guns are being fired. You can put silencers on rifles and pistols, but you have to plan for that. You have to requisition or have a silencer to put on your weapon. So it's mostly just kind of understanding that in the greater experience of being a ninja, if you're trying to be stealthy, you're probably just not going to use guns because they're going to be too loud.
I mean, hey, and guns jam, but hands don't. Well, I guess you could jam your fingers, but that's different.
Right. Yeah, you could break your wrist or something.
It still kind of works.
Chris, do you have final questions for Cody? Thoughts?
My final question for you, Cody, is where can we find you online? I mean, we know we can find our Talsorian everywhere. We can find it at cons, at your local bookstore. But what about you personally? How can folks find you, connect with you?
You know, the terrible part of it is I cannot be found anywhere.
I respect that.
I have a Facebook and a Twitter, and I haven't used either of them since like 2016.
Got it. So go to our Talsorian's website, which is rtalsoriangames.com.
If you get involved in our Discord, know that I am lurking constantly. But yeah, I'm afraid I am a bit of an anomaly on the net. I just don't show up.
No, we love that.
Yeah, that's great.
I don't know, Chris, if I could speak for you here. I don't think either of us would do any social media marketing if we were able to not do it, essentially.
If I didn't have to, I would not. I wouldn't even have a smartphone if I didn't have to these days. But, you know, it's a different conversation.
We're gonna go to Spirit Lanterns as soon as that technology exists. If I can pay a ghost to whisper mentally at my friends, we'll figure that out. Well, Cody, thanks so much. Is there anything else you wanted to say on the pod? Anything about Shadowscar or any other projects? We didn't even really spend that much time on other projects. I'm not sure if Shadowscar is consuming all your time these days. If you have any sense of what's next, or you work on other games.
Shadowscar is basically consuming my life at the moment.
Yeah,
makes sense.
I don't know. I have something corny to say.
Do it,
please.
Since you guys are a TTRPG design podcast, I just want to say to anybody listening out there, if you want to create a game, just go ahead and do it. You'll learn along the way, but the best way to learn game design is to try and fail a lot.
Truer words were never spoken.
Absolutely, yeah. Get your friends to pretend to be ninja, and maybe they will, to quote Vex in the chat, break their wrists while trying to reload their throwing knives, which is kind of like a gun jamming. No, it's great. I think that's such wonderful advice, Cody, and it's great that you've, kept working on your project alongside The Witcher, which is very different, and now have your original like big vision coming out. So excited to see the full rulebook. The quick start is full of interesting things. It's kind of a whole bunch of materials in there. So definitely worth picking up. And yeah, there is the free sort of single quick start, basically, that you can find on DriveThru and maybe other places. Definitely on DriveThru.
Definitely on DriveThru.
So yeah, thank you for joining us, Cody Pondsmith of our Talsorian Games. And please, anytime, if you want to come back when Shadowscar is officially out, if you want to do some play testing, let us know. And we occasionally do that. So
awesome.
We're around. This is Why We Roll, the TTRPG game design podcast. And
yeah, it is.
Yeah, we're happy spooky season.
Yeah, happy spooky season. It's official. Thanks everybody so much for watching, for listening, and we will see you next time.
Awesome. I'm clicking end stream.